everyone. I think we're going to get started. We've had quite a lot of people register for today's webinar, so I expect the numbers to sort of trickle in over the next 10-15 minutes or so, but I think we'll get started in the meantime. So thank you very much for joining the conversation today about fundraising in the face of COVID-19. I'm Emma Columbrander, head of the Global Distributors Collective. I'm very happy to have you all here today. So based on registrations, we've had quite a good mix on this call of GDC members and other stakeholders from across the sector who work to support distributors, which is great to see. So looking forward to all of your questions later in the conversation. So let's kick off by looking at the agenda. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're first of all going to take a look at what kinds of funding distributors are looking for. We'll then give a bit of an overview of different types of funding opportunities available for last mile distributors, broken down by type. So we'll look at grant and debt and equity funding. We'll be joined by 5 panelists, 3 funders with explicit experience and interest in supporting last mile distributors, and 2 GDC members who've been successful in raising funding over the course of the COVID-19 crisis. So we'll be asking them a few questions and then we'll open up the conversation to Q&A from everyone else. So if you do have questions, feel free to start sending them through as we go via the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So next slide. What kinds of funding are last mile distributors looking for? So as you might have seen when you registered for this webinar, we asked GDC members to fill out a couple of questions asking about changes in sales volume since the pandemic and what types of financing they've been able to raise during the crisis and are looking to raise moving forward. So the data that you can see on this slide and in future slides comes from those findings. We had 56 respondents, which represents roughly 1/3 of our membership. So this is quite a nice little snapshot. So in terms of changes in sales as a result of COVID-19, as you can see on the top right, 86% of distributors are experiencing significantly or slightly reduced sales volumes, and sales have remained unchanged or increased for only 14% of members. Unsurprisingly, financing remains a top priority for last mile distributors. 86% of our members are actively looking for finance, mostly for grants, but also for debt and a small percentage for equity as well. The total amount of funding that's sought by those 56 respondents is 13 million. If you extrapolate that to our 170 members, we're looking at a total funding need of about $40 million. But those funding needs vary hugely, as you can see on the left, from as little as $15,000 to $4 million, and that reflects the diversity of membership. The primary need for that funding is for working capital, followed by relief. Next slide, please. So there are clearly challenges with raising funding in times of uncertainty like this, but a range of funders do remain active. These include a handful of funds that are focused on relief, as well as grant funders, lenders, and investors continuing operations. And actually about 38% of members have succeeded in raising funds since the pandemic started, which is surprisingly high. So the next slides are going to look at what funding opportunities are available with the focus on those that are relevant for GDC members, but we will have a more complete list available on our website. And I think it's important not just to consider whether it's possible to raise funding right now, but also whether it's the best thing to do. We've had members report that the uncertainty around the crisis has meant that getting funding on the right terms has been really difficult. Next slide. So who is providing grants to last mile distributors? Well, first of all, we should say that last mile distributors are actually pretty good at raising grant funding. So pre-crisis, we found that 86% of GDC members have raised grant funding, and this has primarily been small-scale seed funding. And 1/4 of members have been able to raise grants during the crisis. The most common sources of grant funding are bilateral aid agencies and foundations, and grant allocation is typically competitive and it's based on defined windows as opposed to rolling applications. So here on this slide, you can see a list of the most common grant funders. USAID is quite a prolific grant funder in the last mile distribution sector, operating through a whole range of programs. And some of these, particularly USADF, have been providing additional support to grantees during the crisis. Right now, only DIV, Development Innovation Ventures, appears to be open, but note this program does tend to support larger, more established companies. The Clean Cooking Alliance has funded a number of members in the cooking sector, most recently through its Venture Catalyst program, but unfortunately it doesn't have any windows currently open. D-Prize, a foundation, has seed funded a significant number of GDC members. It's for early stage companies just starting out piloting innovations in distribution, and it's currently open and accepting applications until the 13th of July. AECF provide funding and advisory support to companies in the agribusiness and clean energy sectors, and they've just closed a relief fund in Kenya to which we know a large number of members have applied. And we are lucky enough to have a speaker here from AECF today who can shed a bit more light on what AECF and other donors are looking for at this time. And finally, the Dune Foundation have also supported a number of members. They provide both grants and loans. Again, they tend to support larger, more established companies. They are still receiving applications at this time. As you can see on the bottom left of the screen, there are a number of other grant funders with a track record of supporting distributors, but unfortunately none of these currently have open windows. So next slide, we're going to look at loans. So before the crisis, 69% of distributors had raised debt funding, and interestingly, 20% have raised funding via crowd lending platforms. So that has been the most common source of debt for distributors. 18% of members have either been able to restructure existing loans or raise new debt during the crisis. So here again, we have the top debt funders of GDC members, all of which are actively lending. So the first two are Kiva and BetterVest, both crowd lending platforms, and both are offering particularly flexible terms in the face of the crisis. Beneficial Returns, third on the list, they make equipment loans of 50K to 500K to social enterprises addressing poverty in Latin America and in Southeast Asia. And we will hear shortly from Ted Levinson from Beneficial Returns, who can provide a bit of additional insight about what type of support they provide. And then next on the list, we have SEMA and Angaza's new Distributor Financing Fund, which supports off-grid solar distributors in Africa. And I'm hoping that we actually have Erin from SEMA on the line. And if you are there, Erin, it would be great if you can just give us a 1-minute overview of the Distributor Financing Fund and its very recent investments.
Yep, should I go now?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. This is Erin from SEMA. So SEMA and Angaza have launched a distributor finance fund focused on users of Angaza's PayGo software. We're backed by the Shell Foundation, Skull Foundation, and Kenya. We are actively deploying funding. So we have already lent to Easy Solar, closed that deal in June. And we have 2 more deals coming up the pipeline. I believe you'll be hearing from Deevabits out of Kenya later today. And we have another deal that we're looking at in DRC. And we're actively looking for more strong pipeline. We do take a data-focused strategy using the Angaza data. That is a critical piece to our investment thesis. We're not specifically COVID relief funding. We are aiming to, just address inventory and working capital needs of distributors. So would love to hear from you or get in touch with your Angaza relationship manager.
Cool. Thank you very much, Erin. Okay, and then as you can see on the bottom left of the screen, again, some examples of other debt funders who have each supported a handful of last mile distributors as well. So next slide, equity. Equity is really hard for last mile distributors, and the vast majority of distributors who have raised equity have raised it from individuals. So mostly family, friends, angel investors, or indeed founders themselves. And this type of equity makes sense for startups, but it's not enough for distributors seeking to grow. And our State of the Sector report at the end of last year found that only 14% of members have raised equity from impact investors. And as you can see here, only 2% have succeeded in raising equity during the crisis. And where the type of large-scale, long-term equity that distributors need does exist, it tends to be pretty concentrated in the energy access sector. So as you can see on this slide, the most common equity funders for GDC members are Acumen and Gaia Impact Fund, who operate globally. Acumen provides patient capital of 250K to 3 million, while Gaia provide slightly smaller ticket sizes of 150 to 500K. And then Ongi and Persistent Energy, who operate in sub-Saharan Africa, and again, with a focus on energy. Other equity funders who have supported distributors include Energy Access Ventures, AHL, Venture Partners, and Beyond Capital Fund. And we're lucky to have here as one of our speakers, Dan Murphy from Venture Builder. Venture Builder is a new investor specifically targeting local distributors, so he can shed a bit more light on the state of the equity investment market shortly. Next slide, please. So finally, relief funding. So relief funding, whether grants or concessional debt, is focused on overcoming a specific crisis rather than supporting business operations or growth. There are several country-specific relief funding mechanisms supported by governments, but unfortunately much fewer are available at the global scale and are relevant for GDC members. Open Road Alliance, many of you will have heard of, they offer emergency funding to social impact organisations affected by COVID-19 and other emergencies. So examples of the types of emergencies where they look to intervene include changes in government regulation, delayed disbursements from equity funders, supply chain disruptions, and so on. They refer to these types of emergencies as oh my God moments. They are sector and geographically agnostic, but they focus on businesses and nonprofits that have potential for what they call catalytic impact. Next, the COVID-19 Energy Access Relief Fund is expected to launch this month, and it will offer concessionary debt funding to off-grid companies. But given that it has a 200K minimum relief loan threshold based on annual staff costs, we don't expect this to be accessible for the majority of our members. And then finally, the trust fund listed here has supported some GDC members with emergency loans, and that's backed by beneficial returns, again on our call today. But this fund is restricted to graduates of the Miller Centre for Social Entrepreneurship GSBI program. I should also highlight that there are some opportunities for emergency technical assistance available. So we recently partnered with CGAP and Frankfurt Management School, who are now supporting 7 GDC members with pro bono technical assistance. Many, many thanks to CGAP. And I should also highlight Get Invest, which is now providing pro bono technical assistance to companies in the energy access sector with a turnover of minimum 100K. So that is accessible for a large number of our members. We are working to keep on top of and advocate for relief funding opportunities for distributors, and ideally would like to see a dedicated grant relief facility for GDC members, and we will keep you updated on these efforts. So that's enough from me. Next slide, please. Let's move on to our panel conversation. Very excited to have this group with us today, sharing their insights. We have Caroline Torowitich, the sector team lead for renewable energy and climate technologies at AECF. AECF provide grant and debt funding to businesses in Africa. They've supported 267 companies in 26 countries in agribusiness and renewable energy. We have Ted Levinson from Beneficial Returns, founder and CEO, a debt funder I introduced earlier. Dan Murphy from Venture Builder, managing director. As I said, they provide equity investments and fully funded enterprise development services to African-owned and African-managed off-grid solar companies. And then we have 2 GDC members. We've got David Wanjo, Managing Director at Deevabits, which distributes solar products to underserved rural communities in Kenya via a network of village solar entrepreneurs, 80% of whom are women. And to date, they've reached 75,000 people. And Sujata Ramani, CEO at Pollinate Group. Pollinate Group empowers women as leaders of change to distribute products that improve health, save time and money for low-income urban and rural communities in India and Nepal. And their range of products spans energy, water and sanitation, and health and appliances, and they've reached over 650,000 people to date. So we're going to ask our panel a few questions, again looking at grant, debt and equity funding separately, and then open it up to the audience. So if I can ask all my speakers to put their videos on, that would be great. Next slide, please. We're going to look at grant funding first. As mentioned, about half of our members are currently looking for grant funding. So Caroline, over to you. It would be great if you could shed some light on how COVID-19 is affecting how donors make funding decisions and affect and assess risk.
Thank you, Emma, and good evening, everybody, and good afternoon for some of you. I think I will start with the reason why currently there's funding going on, like what we did recently with the ACF. The main objective for that fund was to mainly preserve the development impact in the sector and also to guarantee energy access to the households. You know, at this time when they're undergoing many pressures and risks to their economic, to their livelihoods. So the main issues that donors are currently looking at is how COVID-19 has affected countries themselves. What is the impact to the sectors, to the specific sectors? In this case, it is the energy sector. How the restrictions in the different countries are affecting the sector and how that sector has been classified. And I think in many countries, energy was classified as essential service, which really helps in even fast tracking some of those decisions. And generally how the sector is performing. I think there were many instances where it was reported that there's increased demand for some services. And so those are the things that donors will be looking at. And specifically how the investees or the sub-grantees are performing themselves, how they're adapting to the restrictions put in place by different governments, how they're also changing their way of doing business, how they're adapting their business models. Are they moving towards digitization so that you also guard your investments and also you check their business viability, how are their business models changing, how depending on what it was in the beginning. So looking at the business model, looking at the business viability, just to provide comfort to the donors. And but the main thing is looking at whether there is still demand for the products that the companies are still offering, and also changing then the modality of providing that funding. A case, for example, for ACF, looking at can we provide moratoriums to investees who had repayable grants? Are we able? So we provide that flexibility based on case-by-case basis, and also based on the country basis. Yeah, Emma.
That's great. Thanks, Caroline. Okay, so I think let's look at the member perspective. So Sujata and David, you've both been successful in raising grant funding over this period. Maybe Sujata, can you tell us a little bit about your experience raising grant funding? And in particular, Pollinate Group ran a very, very successful campaign raising over $100,000. So it would be great if you can tell us a bit about that and what made that campaign successful.
Thank you, Emma, and hello, fellow participants and fellow panelists. Lovely to be here this evening. Yes, I think when the pandemic hit us, 2 out of the 3 revenue streams that Pollinate enjoyed were just wiped out overnight, and we had to really quickly huddle to see how can we look at alternate sources of revenue. Philanthropy was the only one that was available. The other sources of revenue, which was our fellowships and our ability to be in the marketplace to distribute goods and continue our business, were just wiped out overnight. We looked at all kinds of sources of funding available at that time. We continued to apply for grants, and we looked at a lot of debt instruments. And we said, look at our balance sheet, look at our cash flow, understand what do we need to extend our runway until end of the year. We definitely had a positive outlook for the next year. So we said we need to stay afloat by end of the year. And that's when we started looking at the option of bringing in our fundraise campaign, which could have ideally started in the month of May, but we pulled it in to start it in April. And as we launched the fundraise program, both India and Nepal were on lockdown. They had just announced lockdown at that time. But what we did was to go back to our, consistent donors, our profile of philanthropists that were always a part of our journey, worked with them closely. We worked with all our original co-founders and our patrons from the past and sought their help for the initial month. We started our campaign with a target of 50K, which was by itself double of what we normally would have got in our mid-month campaign. We expected additional support to come from people who wanted to support COVID-impacted organizations and people. And within 30 days, we achieved those numbers. And I think some of the critical things that we did, which ensured that success, was to continue engagement with our donors, work on our social media handles, and keep continuing to talk about what we are going to do with the fund and what have we done up until then. In the first 30 to 40 days, we did about 3,000 calls to our existing entrepreneur network, the women entrepreneurs, who kept giving us on-field information on what they needed and how we could continue to support them. And these are the stories that we took back to our donors to say, this is what your funding is going to help us continue to achieve. And over the next couple of months, we increased our 50K goal to a 100K goal. And I'm extremely happy to report that by June 30th, we closed our fundraise at 133K. Some interesting statistics to look back and dice the data is to notice that nearly 44% of the donations came from new donors for Pollinate. So that's something that we're extremely pleased. We want to nurture and continue our engagement with that profile and list of donors who have come to us. Their initial contributions are not as much as the 40% as in terms of the numbers. But yes, there is scope for working on them. And this proves that we've been able to talk a completely new audience, and we've been able to excite and impact a new set of audience that are wanting to help last mile distributors and workers like us who are working on women empowerment. So that's about the fundraise activity. And I think if you want to synopsize the last couple of minutes conversation, I think we have a very clear strategy on who we will go to. And we had a very clear strategy of constant communication with our current set of donors, and we reached out to no audience through our social media handles, and we just dared to ask. We just said, let's not leave any stone unturned. We should keep asking. So that's exactly what we did.
That's awesome. Thanks, Sujata. Very powerful that 44% of your donors were new donors. I think that really shows the power of crowdfunding and how you can really attract new networks through crowdfunding. And so, David, what about you? You've been able to successfully raise grants as well. And I understand you've also had some pro bono technical support over the last month. So it'd be great if you can tell us a little bit about that experience as well.
Right, great. One thing I want to say is that at the start of the crisis, one of the things that we had to do swiftly was start planning for different scenarios that might emerge from this. And, it's part of trying to assume the worst and trying to assume maybe it might not be that worst. And, from that scenario planning, we were able to actually come up with quick decisions. Like, for example, if this worst case happens, we might probably have issues with revenue, collections, and so many other things. So, we had to develop a quick strategy in terms of how do we fix our short-term working capital needs. And, and in that coming in place, that really helps also to mention that our success in fundraising grants, we had to rely hugely on our current grant funders. So I would say as an advice is that you have to maintain very good reputation with your current donors. Because those are the first people who actually will come to your aid, because they know you, they know your struggles, they know your journey. So we were actually able to reach out to them and tell them, this is the current position in Kenya, these are the possible scenarios, and this is what the impact on our business will look like. So we, and you're able to actually now justify the ask and say, if we have this, we're able to, you know, fix 1, 2, 3 items, and our business will survive because it's more for relief funding. The other thing is also trying to think in terms of the donor. So the donor have their own interest. They have their own targets they want to meet, and it's trying to align yourself with what the donor also wants to achieve. And in our case, we had several iterations with our proposal. Like the first idea that we wanted was like almost went through, then we had like several, like 3 other more proposals. And one of them was very aligned with what the donor wanted. And that went through and helped us to actually have some good funding to last us during this relief period. So I would say, yeah, so that comes handy in terms of also communicating. You have to communicate very well, communicate with your donors, communicate with your support system, reach out to your mentors, advisors, and support networks. That's what we did. And as my my other panelists have said, don't be afraid to ask. Ask for support, ask for help. Reached out to different people. We got connected to different people. Hey, have you heard about this application? Look for it. Have you heard of this opportunity? And through that, in addition to us getting the funding, we've also been able to get support from Off-Grid Talent Initiative to actually be able to have more talents in the organization, helping us with customer care support. And it's still an ongoing conversation for the next 12 months, which is really good support. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask for support. And then the other thing is rely hugely on networks. You have to build networks. Because that's also talking about, because we have also been able to raise some funds through crowdfunding, but more of debt. And this relies hugely on the value of the network that you have built over time. So you have to build meaningful relationships over time, establish partnerships, establish very good support throughout, and always ask for support because somebody knows someone who can support you in your journey. So that's one advice I would actually tell people in terms of crowdfunding.
Great, thank you, David. Both you and Sujata have had very successful crowdfunding experiences, which is great to see. So just a reminder to feel free to shoot through any questions that you have into the chat and we can pick them up as we go. But I think now let's move on to look at debt funding. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So 43% of members, as we said earlier, are looking for loans right now. So with that in mind, Ted, I'd like to turn it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected the way lenders assess loan applications? And you can see I've got some questions here for you as well. So to help people on the call understand a bit more about how lenders are responding to the crisis. So I'll let you pick up some of those questions as you go.
Thank you, Emma. Glad to be with everyone today. I would summarize it that lenders, like the rest of the world, are panicking, and we feel very nervous about the future. And most people react to that by reducing the risks that they're taking. And so I'm afraid that my message is pretty sobering, but I think overwhelmingly you'll find that lenders are pulling back, less willing to take on risk that they may have considered before. And many of them have stopped lending altogether or have slowed that down substantially. And so I recognize that last mile distributors have always struggled to secure debt financing. And I think that in almost all cases, that assignment has just gotten significantly harder because of the crisis. The little bit of good news that I can say is that there are lenders out there. The Trust Fund is one of them. You also introduced Open Road Alliance on the call. There are many funders that exist that have special programs designed exclusively as a response to COVID. I urge everyone to go to a website that my friends at Duke University have started. The name's kind of terrible, but covidcap.com is, I believe, the most complete list and searchable database of opportunities for support for social enterprises to to secure grants or loans during this time. And that's a very good source for information. I have heard of many lenders that are willing to restructure their loans at beneficial returns. We offered all of our borrowers a 3-month payment holiday that is just coming to an end now. But I absolutely think that I encourage everyone on the call to approach their lenders to ask for some accommodation under the circumstances and to turn to those lenders for additional support. I think notwithstanding what Sujata shared about the Pollinate's ability to attract new individual donors, I think this is a very challenging time to attract new institutional lenders unless they have money earmarked, especially for COVID. And so I would urge you instead to redouble your efforts with your existing lenders and organizations that you have strong connections with. Are lenders lending to specific parts of operations? Yes, but I think growth is the least, the area that has the least support right now. As a lender, we're always looking for growing businesses to support, and I'm very dubious about social enterprises that are looking to invest now in growth, because I see so few opportunities for that growth and so much uncertainty ahead. So occasionally there are some compelling cases, but I think right now most people are dealing with reduced sales, challenges to their supply chain, and customers that are unable to pay. And so it's working capital that people are looking for first and foremost.
Thanks, Ted. So David and Sujata, again, both of you have been able to raise debt at this time. So I know you've touched a little bit on some of your experience in raising debt in the previous question, but is there anything else that you'd like to add or to respond to anything that David has said about your experience with raising new debt? David, I'll turn to you first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so in terms of raising debt and restructuring existing one, you come to just an addition to what I just mentioned before, is that you have to have open communication with your current lenders and talk them through about different scenarios. So we were able to do that with one of our current donors, which was Kiva, and they were willing to defer payments. We hadn't even defaulted yet, but they were understanding like the COVID-19 pandemic might even interfere with our collections. And they're like, okay, they're okay to defer payments. And in addition, they also agreed to actually give us an extra debt facility, which was a really good boost in relief fund. And the other component is that relying on your networks, for example, so Deevabits has been an alumni of GSBI, and GSBI had partnered with beneficial returns for the trust fund. And so reaching out to them, they were like, we have this opportunity, try it out. We applied, we were going for the full amount. We never got the full, but we got some significant amount of funding that was really helpful, because a lot of funding that we were chasing through were also coming through. So it's actually said that the debt that we got from trust fund was also very sufficient to help us bridge the gap, especially during this COVID-19. And just to mention one of our last debt facilities, which is very helpful even during COVID, but it was, we started the conversation before COVID-19, and it's a fund that is that will also last beyond the COVID-19, which is for normal business. It's with the Simangaza Distributor Finance Fund, which is a really good fund for most distributors if you're looking to raise funds, because it's data driven. So most of distributors like Deevabits don't have a lot of collateral, and you can use now your Angaza sales data to actually be able to structure a loan facility with Simangaza And that relationship we started some time back. And just to give some advice is that raising debt is not that easy, but it's really doable for a lot of distributors, because you have to have very thorough preparation, know what you want, have a really good financial model, and and be able to have the model in a way that it can accommodate different scenarios, bad case scenarios and best case scenarios. Yeah, but I would say it's a really good. We are a testimony that distributors, even small ones, can be able actually to raise funds. And as long as you know what you're looking for and you have a really good strategic plan. So I think that's just the addition I would actually want to comment on that.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.
Sujata, anything to add from your end? I mean, just to also ask, I know both you and David have been able to renegotiate terms with some of your suppliers as well. So is there anything that you want to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think David touched upon some of the key criteria that all of us, used. But I'd like just to take a step back and look at some of our first steps we took. We want to look at our cash flow statement to see if the organization had the appetite for debt. Debt is not an easy instrument. It is a huge load and burden on the organization. So when we did our scenario planning, we looked at 3 scenarios and understood in what scenario was debt a feasible instrument that we can take up. And that was the first step, just to understand if we still had the appetite and the ability to take on a loan and the ability to be able to repay the loan in the defined time. Once that was defined, then we looked at partners that were very sensitive to the kind of vision that we had, and were also with the mindset of social impact, and had the ability to understand the constraints and strains of our business model. And having said that, we applied for 2-3 different loans. And of course, Ted is right here. He will probably tell us why he chose us. But I think some of the points that we believe helped us go past the line was to define a very clear strategy and look at the risks that we were walking into, and be able to articulate and provide mitigation plans towards those risks, and be able to also reconstruct ourselves to have a clearly defined way forward plan, which is significantly different from what we did before, not because we wanted to, but basically we had to. And that was one of the biggest reasons that I think we were able to go past. And we did a lot of deep searching within our past experience, and spoke to a whole lot of people who were also in the same situation. And we took a lot of mentoring and help from people around us to help us put forth our proposal. Having said all of that, I think the biggest reason is, of course, the strength of the organization, the business model that you have, which is resilient and which has huge forward-looking impact if you continue to, stay on course. And good governance that we put in place over the last several years. Emma, you know that very well. So I think those were some of the key reasons that we were able to get past the line for loans that we secured.
That's great.
Maybe I can just jump in for a moment, because it's the coincidence that both Deevabits and Pollinate are borrowers through the trust fund. And what we saw in their applications was first organizations that had responded very quickly to the crisis, and had done so by making a lot of very significant cuts to their operations, and ones that had, frankly, a pessimistic view about the future. And so I think entrepreneurs are accustomed to painting a very rosy picture about the future and using that to secure money. But when you're looking for debt, and particularly in a crisis like we're experiencing now, it's very refreshing to work with entrepreneurs that are taking a worst case scenario outlook and are making a case about how they can still repay the loan. And so we were comforted to see both Deevabits and Pollinate and the other borrowers that we approved that they were taking a worst case attitude towards the crisis, and that gave us comfort that they would be good stewards of our money. And so our loans through the trust fund are inherently risky, but we felt that there was competent management running the organizations, and that they would use that money wisely and to stay in business as long as possible, and hopefully outlast this virus.
That's super interesting, Ted, and I would be very interested to hear Caroline's response to that in particular. But before we do, I just want to move to the last piece of this, which is about equity, because I want to hear from Dan. So maybe let's pick that back up shortly. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So Dan, you're flying solo on the equity front. The question for you really is it possible, and indeed is it appropriate for distributors to be raising equity now during a crisis? And if so, what type of instruments are most relevant for distributors, and what are investors thinking about when evaluating companies in the crisis?
Great, thanks very much, Emma. And I think before speaking to the specific questions that you've put to me, maybe just a bit of a preamble and context, and to build upon the somewhat sobering messaging that Ted started out with. I think also on the equity side right now, the market is very, very constrained. So existing investors are first and foremost looking to their portfolio companies and really looking to make sure that those businesses not just survive the crisis, but thrive in the context of it. So I think that's a very stark reality that that the GDC members need to be aware of. With that being said, I do think it's absolutely possible. Maybe just to share a little bit the story on the venture builders side, when the COVID pandemic really revealed its full power in March, we convened a board meeting and to ask ourselves, what do we do? I mean, we are early stage equity investors, and should we sit on the sidelines and ride this out, or take a different approach? And in fact, the resounding view was that we needed to lean in, and that we needed to be listening to our customers. And in our case, our customers are enterprises that we could consider partnering with. And so that's what we've done since mid-March. And by way of illustration, we actually had our first transaction. So Venture Builder is a relatively new facility. We officially launched in October of 2019. We had our first transaction was actually with our board when COVID hit, and we went back to the drawing board a little bit and restructured that package, and have just now closed that transaction. And I'm happy to say that it's actually a GDC member that is benefiting from that, and that will be kind of fully disclosed in the next couple of weeks. The other pivot that we made was to think about what we refer to as enterprise development services, so advisory services into the businesses. And what we've done is to go back into our pipeline and identify businesses that we think are particularly promising, and have basically put together packages of what we're calling COVID-19 resiliency support. So a lot of the measures that the entrepreneurs on the panel alluded to in terms of contingency planning, scenario analysis. So we've rolled up our sleeves, and we're working with a handful of businesses to help them through the crisis. Of course, that also gives us an opportunity to get to know those enterprises and those entrepreneurs much better, which is something that's really important to do, particularly in a situation like this. So definitely possible, but not without its challenges. I think in terms of the instruments that are most appropriate for last mile distributors, typically last mile distributors would be looking to raise relatively modest sums of money. I think for businesses for whom it's the first kind of outside equity investment that you're taking in, I think you definitely want to be looking at convertible notes or quasi-equity that is basically deferring the discussion around the valuation of the business. Typically, valuations are done by looking at metrics, and the most concrete metric typically is revenues, both trailing revenues over the past months or years, and then also forward-looking projections in terms of what that revenue would look like, and then coming up with a multiplier of those revenues to derive a value. Obviously, right now, revenues would be perceived as impaired, and so valuations would perhaps be tighter than entrepreneurs would like. So I do think that deferring that discussion is definitely in entrepreneurs' best interest. But again, as the other panelists have said, I think it's important to be resilient and to be resourceful and to be scrappy and to look far and wide to source that funding. And I definitely think it can happen. In terms of the valuation side of things, I alluded to sort of the quantifiable metrics. I personally think that what is more important, particularly when you're making early stage investments into a business, it's a partnership. It's a long-term partnership when you're looking to find an equity investor. And so what we're really looking for are more of the qualitative aspects of the business, the founding team, the senior leadership team, in particular in the context of COVID-19, how are these entrepreneurs responding to the crisis? How aware and willing to acknowledge are they of not just the challenges and risks that they're facing, but also some of the opportunities that may be emerging for them in the context of C-19. And so I think that that's really important to us, is to make sure that we can actually work with this team really closely and help them to make it through the crisis itself.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. I like the advice about being scrappy. I think that kind of sums up the last mile distribution business quite nicely. Okay, that's been really interesting. And actually, one member has just fed back based on what you and Ted and Caroline were saying, that it is reinforcing the fact that it is a hot, dry desert out there, and that the water truck isn't here yet, which I think is kind of a good summary of where we are. That there isn't a lot of funding out there for last mile distributors at the moment, and that it is hard, even though Sujata and David have made it look very easy. It's really not. So if we can just go to the next slide, please. We're going to open it up to Q&A. We've had a couple of questions already come in, but feel free to keep sending them through the chat. The first one that came in is really for you, Ted, which is specifically about debt financing and thinking about what collateral is required for a startup in particular, but I guess for all companies at this point. What has changed during the crisis?
So I think I'd like to answer that question broadly and advise everyone on the call that when you're seeking financing, you're going to be very frustrated unless you do your homework and are clear around what the various investors are expecting. And so at Beneficial Returns, we make loans in Latin America and Southeast Asia, and we lend between $50,000 and $500,000. So businesses can acquire capital to grow. And all of our borrowers are businesses addressing poverty. You would be shocked at how many African businesses that have nothing to do with poverty approach us looking to borrow $1 million for working capital. And so, if you miss one of the criteria and you don't mind rejection, you should certainly reach out. But when you meet none of the criteria, it is a waste of your time to approach lenders that are not candidates to give you a loan. And so I often hear that people tell me that they've approached 100 lenders and been turned down all 100 times. But I think that that's an indication that they're not doing a good job doing their homework. So what collateral is required? I guess my response would be whatever collateral the lender requires. And most lenders are very clear about their criteria. And so I urge you, when you're trying to secure a loan, is identify who your competition is and see where they have raised money. So if you're located, for instance, in Senegal, see all the other businesses that have raised money in Senegal. And if you're delivering cook stoves, see all the other businesses in West Africa that operate in cook stoves, and see where they've raised money. And those are the folks that you should approach.
Thanks, Ted, which is kind of what we've tried to do in this presentation by looking at where distributors have gotten their funding from. I think that's really good advice. So I just wanted to come back to something that you said earlier, Ted, which was about how it was refreshing for you to see entrepreneurs putting forward sort of worst case scenarios. And Caroline, I wanted to come to you and hear your reflections on that, because, you know, as a grant funder, I think it is a little bit different. And you mentioned in the beginning that it was important for companies to show that the market is still there, that demand is still there. So how do companies do that given the uncertainties, and how do you feel about companies coming to you with their kind of worst case scenarios?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I would like to give the scenarios from the applications that we received from the COVID relief that closed last month. I think most of the it is basically looking at the trends over the last 3 months and how the companies are adapting their forecast going forward, and how they're changing their business models to adapt to then fit into the forecast that they're making. Because most of the applications were just talking about they are meeting the restrictions, like how do we provide PPEs, but then there wasn't any, the few were talking about how they're adapting their business models, how they're bringing in, how they're even trying to source locally if they're having issues of getting inventory from outside the country. So those are some of the things, but then we're also looking at how they're taking opportunities from this scenario. Like how many of them are, for example, moving towards digital marketing? How are they adapting their marketing strategies? And because most of them were talking about we've reduced staff to reduce costs. But then in terms of looking at the reason and how they will then meet their obligations in terms of the focus with the reduced staff. So most of it is, for me, I saw that the strategies were almost similar, but for some, they've already thought about the risks and the opportunities during this period, and they've adapted accordingly. And I think for us as ACF, because our main agenda is impact, we also understand that we are not going to achieve impact at this level, but do the companies themselves understand how they are going to reach whatever impact we shall be expecting from them. So many companies have adapted, but most of the adaptation is around distribution and also the protection of staff. But the issues were around replenishment of stock and the restrictions of movement, which then has affected their supply chain. But how are they then adapting to that?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. You've also got a specific question for you in the chat, but instead of opening that up to the conversation, I might sort of direct you to the chat, and if you can respond in the chat, that would be great. Specifically about the React Fund. Okay, so I think we're coming to an end now. So I think what would be great if you go to the next slide, please, is just for each of the speakers to take 30 seconds, so 2 sentences, to just share one final piece of advice, a new piece of advice that you have for last mile distributors who are looking for funding right now. So let's go backwards. We'll go Dan, then Ted, and then David, Sujata, Caroline.
All right, so I guess my main piece of advice would be don't give up, and find ways to persevere. And I think that what last mile distributors are doing is it's a critical service, and that needs to continue. And so you need to do everything you can to sustain that and identify funding partners that will allow you to do that.
My piece of advice, you already know your most likely funder. It's someone who supported you in the past. So go back and ask.
My piece of advice would be ensure that you communicate very well with your partners, with your funders, lenders. Ensure that you build really strong relationships even before a pandemic, because these are the same people who come to your aid when things get south. So always make sure that you're building this meaningful relationship every time.
Yeah, my philosophy is we have this proverb back here in India which says, a crying baby gets the milk. If the baby doesn't cry, it never gets the milk. So I think it's very important to communicate and ask. And I think if you deserve, you will get.
My final say is adapt as much as possible to survive in this period, and adapt as much as possible.
Thank you, Everett. That really was 30 seconds each. That's amazing. So final slide, please, which is just about what next. So as you can see here, we do have a couple more webinars coming up. One is a closed webinar, and it's actually not a webinar. It's a workshop for GDC members only, which is sharing experiences about business continuity planning. So we'll be sharing more detail about that soon. And then we have one on COVID-proofing your sales force coming up in August. So 3 important reminders from us. Our Innovation Challenge is still open and applications close on 13th of July. If you haven't already checked it out, please check it out. Next week is the Energy Access Relief Summit over 2 half days, and we are featuring some GDC members, which is awesome, and talking about last mile distribution at that event. And then finally, if you are an energy access distributor, please, 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 can you look at the Industry Barometer survey, which I emailed you last week. I know you're all sick of surveys, but this is such a great way to get everyone's finger on the pulse and get the voice of last mile distribution heard in the response efforts that are underway. So it takes 10 minutes. Please complete that. We'd be really grateful. And finally, our COVID-19 resources page is up to date, so do check it out for additional resources. And as always, if there's anything else that you think we can do to support you, or if you have any follow-up questions for any of our brilliant speakers on today's webinar, then don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you moving forward. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.